Hey there, internets. So last week, no video. I was out of town and I don't advertise that online. Be kind of embarrassing for the martial arts instructor to get to advertise something like that where everyone could hear it and get his house robbed. So this week, though, I've had some time to do some research. Later this month, it is expected that everyone's talking about the BRICS nations. For those that aren't familiar with who the BRICS nations are, that is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa are expected to be meeting in South Africa with them hosting. And they're going to be discussing various agenda items, but the top one that is actually to be talked about is expansion. Possibility of Saudi Arabia or a couple of other oil-producing countries joining the group. Now, it's partly an economic group. It's not really a military alliance. I mean, China and India came to minor blows back in 2020, 2021 over some border clashes. But the one everyone's talking about is the possibility of a BRICS multinational currency, kind of like the euro, but those other countries, and that it would be gold-backed. Well, of course, that's driving everyone saying, go invest in gold. It's a little bit overblown. This isn't to say it's not something that could happen. It's not something to say that it couldn't create issues for the rest of the world economy, but it's not going to be an overnight thing. For a couple of reasons. One is, I've got some articles to cover here in it, of course, to back myself up because I come with receipts. From Fortune, where's my link here for Fortune? Which headlines, how long will the dollar last as the world's default currency? BRICS nations are gathering in South Africa this August with it on the agenda. We'll go over this article in particular, but there's some various reasons, and one of them is the mechanisms they have to do to even make it happen. The most they could do is say, we have an intention. Largely because they had tasked the New Development Bank, which is the BRICS answer to the IMF, which itself does all but about 22% of its business in dollars. It was trying to do it all in local currencies, but that hasn't panned out because 88% of international trade is done in the dollar. All nations convert money to dollars, sell back and forth, then convert it back into local currency. Or they store currency in dollars. It's also 68% or 58% of the world's cash reserves held by central banks. But this Fortune magazine article, which will be the first in the line, said, could a new currency be set to challenge the dominance of the dollar? Perhaps, but that may not be the point. In August 2023, South Africa will host the leaders of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, a group of nations known by the acronym BRICS. Among the items on the agenda is the creation of a new joint BRICS currency. As a scholar who has studied the BRICS countries for over a decade, I can certainly see why talk of a BRICS currency is gaining currency. The BRICS summit comes as countries across the world are confronting a changing geopolitical landscape that is challenging the traditional dominance of the West. And that is true. China continues to rise economically for the time being. They are starting to feel the demographic pinch, which means their window of being able to challenge the West is narrowing up. And while the BRICS nations have been seeking to reduce their reliance on the dollar for over a decade, Western sanctions on Russia after its invasion of Ukraine have accelerated the process. Again, true. We cut Russia off from SWIFT, which is how banks transmit funds and pass that kind of digital currency back and forth. And they don't have a effective means of doing it otherwise now. Meanwhile, rising interest rates and the recent debt ceiling crisis in the U.S. have raised concerns among other countries that the dollar-denominated debt and demise of the dollar could be the world's should the world's leading economy ever default. This is why you need to stop racking up debt, guys. And this is the painful part. And I'll even address some of the issues here surrounding this, of what it means to fix the problem. All that said, a new BRICS currency faces major hurdles before becoming reality. What currency discussions do show is that BRICS countries are seeking to discover and develop new ideas about how to shake up international affairs and effectively coordinate policies around these ideas. De-dollarization momentum. With 88% of international transactions conducted in U.S. dollars and the dollar accounting for 58% of global foreign exchange reserves, the dollar's dominance is indisputable. Yet de-dollarization, or reducing the economy's reliance on the U.S. dollar for international trade and finance, has been accelerating following the Russian invasion of Ukraine. BRICS countries have been pursuing a wide range of initiatives to decrease their dependence on the dollar. Over the past year, Russia, China, and Brazil have turned to greater use of non-dollar currencies in their cross-border transactions. Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates are actively exploring dollar alternatives, and central banks have sought to shift more of their currency reserves away from the dollar and into gold. And this gets into that backed currency thing. If your nation has gold, you at least have a physical commodity. All the BRICS nations have been critical to the dollar's dominance for different reasons. Russian officials have been championing de-dollarization to ease the pain of sanctions. Because of sanctions, Russian banks have been unable to use SWIFT, the global messaging systems that enables bank transactions. And the West froze Russia's 330 U.S. billion in reserves last year. Meanwhile, the 2022 election in Brazil reinstated Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva as president. Lula is a longtime proponent of BRICS, who previously sought to reduce Brazil's dependence on and vulnerability to the dollar. He has energized the group's commitment to de-dollarization and spoken about creating a new euro-like currency. The Chinese government has also clearly laid out its concerns with the dollar's dominance, labeling it the main source of instability and uncertainty in the world economy. Beijing directly blamed the Fed's interest rate hike for causing turmoil in the international financial markets and substantial depreciation of other currencies. Together with other BRICS countries, China has also criticized the use of sanctions as geopolitical weapons. Understand also, the United States is 24% of the world's GDP by itself. So our nation is so wealthy that, as a whole, that we account for a quarter of the world's wealth. As I told a friend discussing some of the various issues he brought up in the book of Revelation, where it says, hurt not those with the oil and the wine. I'm like, if you're an American, you are the people with the oil and the wine, even if you're poor or relatively poor. The appeal of de-dollarization and possible BRICS currency would be to mitigate such problems. Experts in the U.S. are so deeply divided on its prospects. The U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen believes the dollar will remain dominant in most countries, as most countries have no alternative. Yet a former White House economist sees a way a BRICS currency could end dollar dominance. Currency ambitions. Although the talk of the BRICS currency has gained momentum, there is limited information on various models under construction. But the most ambitious path would be something akin to the euro, the single currency adopted by 11 member states of the European Union in 1999. But negotiating a single currency would be difficult given the economic power asymmetries and complex political dynamics within BRICS. Imagine having a common currency and China and India go to war, for example, over a border. Or, if it's entirely possible, China and Russia. China does want the Russian Far East. As for a new currency to work, the BRICS would need to agree on an exchange rate mechanism, have efficient payment systems, and well-regulated, stable, liquid financial market. To achieve a global currency status, BRICS would have to Need a strong track record of joint currency management to convince others that the new currency is reliable. A BRICS version of the euro is unlikely for now. None of the countries involved show any desire to discontinue its local currency. Rather, the goal appears to be to create an efficient, integrated payment system for cross-border transactions as a first step, and then introduce a new currency. And this is why they state an intention of going that way. You're not going to do it overnight. You're not going to wake up later this month and find out, oh, the yuan and ruble and the rupee have all disappeared and been replaced by the brick. Building blocks for this already exist. In 2010, the BRICS Interbank Cooperation Mechanism was launched to facilitate cross-border payments between BRICS banks in local currencies. BRICS nations have been developing BRICS Pay, a payment system for transactions among the BRICS without having to convert to the local currency into dollars. And then there has been talk of a BRICS cryptocurrency, and strategically aligning the development of the central bank digital currencies to promote currency interoperability and economic integration. Since many countries expressed an interest in joining BRICS, the group is likely to scale its de-dollarization agenda. From BRICS vision to reality, to be sure, some of the group's most ambitious past initiatives to set up the major BRICS projects to parallel non-Western infrastructure have failed. Big ideas like developing a BRICS credit rating agency and creating a BRICS undersea cable never materialized. Again, may not happen. You can have ideas, but unless you make them happen, it doesn't do it. De-dollarization efforts have been struggling at multilateral and the bilateral level. In 2014, when BRICS countries launched the new development bank, its founding agreement outlined that its operations may provide financing in the local currency of a country in which the operation takes place. Yet in 2023, the bank remains heavily dependent on the dollar for survival. Local currency financing represents about 22% of the bank's portfolio, although the new president hopes to increase it to 30% by 2026. So even in their own international version of the IMF, they're using dollars. That's not something they can easily do because so many countries trade with each other. Similar challenges exist in bilateral and de-dollarization efforts. Russia and India have sought to develop a mechanism for trading in local currencies, which would enable Indian importers to pay for Russia's cheap oil and coal in rupees. However, talks were suspended after Moscow cooled to the idea of rupee accumulation. Despite the barriers to de-dollarization, the BRICS group determined to act should not be dismissed. Their determination to act should not be dismissed. The group has been known for defying expectations in the past. Despite many differences among the five countries, the bloc managed to develop joint policies and survive major crises, such as the 2021 China-India border clashes and the war in Ukraine. BRICS has deepened its cooperation, invested in new financial institutions, and has been continuously broadening the range of policy issues it addresses. It now has a huge network of interlinked mechanisms that connect government officials, businesses, academics, think tanks, and other stakeholders across countries. Even if there is no movement on the joint currency front, there are multiple issues in which BRICS finance ministers as well as central bankers regularly coordinate, and the potential for developing new financial collaborations is particularly strong. No doubt, talk of a new BRICS currency in itself is an important indicator of the desire of many nations to diversify away from the dollar. I believe focusing on BRICS currently risks missing the forest for the trees. The new global economic order will not emerge out of a new BRICS currency or de-dollarization happening overnight, but it can potentially emerge out of BRICS' commitment to coordinating their policies and innovating, something this currency initiative represents. And that's part of what's going on here. I remember seeing an article where I think it was Steve Forbes had said eventually all these nations are going to go back, after they race to the bottom by printing money, they'll all realize the bad idea and go back to the gold standard. So some of those things, it took 50 years to create the euro. And it started with creating a mechanism for easy trade in your local currencies with it rather than the dollar. The U.S. backed some of that. So they would, and apparently China has the actual name of their currency is the I'm going to hopefully not butcher this name, the renminbi. But it's also called, most of us refer to it as the won or yuan. So their first step is just going to be pegging their dollars to that, because the Chinese currency, China is the big boy in the room. They're directing it. Everyone has this conspiracy theory about the Amero, and that they'd get rid of the U.S. dollar and replace it with the Amero. Really, what would happen is Canada and Mexico would align their exchange rates with the dollar and replace their currency with the dollar effectively. It's the same kind of thing, but China, Russia, India, Brazil, South Africa. Now, idea of them being a military alliance, honestly, it'd be more like the Axis in World War II, a bunch of co-belligerents against a bunch of actual allies, which means they wouldn't be, somebody might seek a separate peace. They may not, they can't coordinate that well. They don't have common borders with each other, ability to share a lot of stuff, except for China and Russia. And the thing with it is they all trade mainly with China, with very little by and large between each other. You see a little bit between India and Russia. You might, but you don't see like India and South Africa doing a lot of trade. India and Brazil doing a lot of trade. And they all still have to trade with the U.S., which means the United States dollar then still has to get used. You have to exchange at some point. A lot of other countries will still trade with the U.S. How are they going to have to trade? In dollars. In terms of the political ability to influence this, India, in another article, and I may not have that one up, their leadership is not on board with a common currency between them. They're wanting to strengthen the rupee. So, where's this going? It's probably not going into a new currency later this month. So, they have to create the mechanism to trade, they have to peg their currencies together, and then they have to have a credit system, so when you have among them where they can even things out, where maybe some countries are running trade deficits with each other. They don't have any of that. But then you talk about the gold standard side of it. So I went and looked up the gold. This little project started with, I think I was listening to Tim Pool, and he was bringing this up and letting it get overblown so I looked up who's got gold reserves. And I found this will be your second link in the description below, with other links following that kind of support some of this. I looked up the gold reserves by country, and guess who's on top? The United States. According to this, which was last confirmed in December of 2021, 8,133 metric tons of gold. That's how much we have. That's more than twice what the next largest nation has, and that was Germany, which has 3,359. Germany, Italy, and France combined do exceed us, as does the EU. Germany, Italy, and France, their combined gold reserves, just the three of them, are 8,274 metric tons. But here's the thing. BRICS nations, which is Russia and China, their numbers 5 and 6, respectively. Double check that. Yeah, 5 and 6. They, them and India, and when I combine all the BRICS nations, they've got 5,256 tons of gold. United States has roughly 1.5 times what the BRICS nations has, gold-wise. If everyone starts running back to the gold standard. The EU has 10,883 and change metric tons of gold when you combine all the EU countries. I went and added them all up. And just to give you some perspective, you think about how big China is compared to Taiwan. Taiwan has 424 metric tons of gold, which is roughly about 20%, a little over, using the same website. I found one that said, another website that said China now had a little over 2,000 tons of gold. But Taiwan has roughly 20% of what China has by itself. And there's all these other nations that are allied with us that would continue to trade in dollars, like the Japanese, like the EU. So the dollar's not going anywhere. It could take a hit. If we took the step to go back to a gold standard ourselves, and one thing that's not understood in history is that the reason we went to the gold standard versus originally being gold and silver as a mix was because after one of the Franco-Prussian Wars, Germany got a big indemnity of gold out of the French, and then took that gold and said, we're going to go to a gold standard. Well, that forced us to do the same to protect the value of our money, which pretty much killed the value of the pound sterling because it was made from silver. The British were backing their coinage, their money with silver, or just using silver coins. So if we had to respond in kind, it would actually, based on, when I looked up to see how many dollars were out there, the first website I found said 2.26 trillion. I found another that said 2.33 trillion. I went with the first one I found. I'd already done the math, but it obviously would go higher, a little higher with this. The amount of troy ounces of gold that is over 261 million troy ounces. That works out to $8,643. Gold is currently trading around $2,000, maybe a little less. Last I looked. So, in fact, I can even look that up. Google. So, it's not going anywhere. And if they do, it's not this thing that's going to be just devastating. Because it's not, your economy is not just how much gold you have, not just the idea of the petrodollar, spot value of gold. So per ounce today, it's $1,900 per ounce. So it would more than quadruple. So it's not going anywhere. It is very much overblown. But what would it take for us to do that? Probably a currency reform. You wouldn't be able to keep running endless deficits under a gold-backed currency and extremely high deficits, which means you're going to have to do something about Social Security, going to have to do something about Medicaid, and at least get close to balance on your budget. Really, you should just get balance and you solve a lot of your problems anyway. So that's where it's at. Is it a concern? Possibly. Is it going to devastate the nation's economy or the world's economy by the end of the month? No. So, a little overblown, guys, but something to think about. There are people with other geopolitical goals that are not necessarily economic that want to get away from the dollar. But where it's 88% of transactions and almost 60% of reserves, I understand the euro is another 20%. Well, you're already past 3/4 of the world's reserves with that. The yen is another 5%, 5.5%, with some of these other currencies making up the rest of the foreign exchange reserves. It's not going anywhere. End of story. At least in the foreseeable future. Even if they say it is our intention to create our own currency, it's not likely to go anywhere. Could it take a hit if Saudi Arabia takes cash other than the dollar for oil? Yeah, but the only thing they could take is the Chinese currency. And no one's using that for a reserve currency, so who has it? It's still going to be dollars. That's just the way it is. No one's going to run out and get a bunch of yuan just so they can go buy oil. They're already going to have the dollar, so they'll pay for it with the dollars. So otherwise, like this video if you've found any of this information valuable. Subscribe if you haven't. Share it with a friend. Leave a comment in that bottom. Maybe you disagree with me. Until then, you all take care.